This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. On the night of December 14, 1920, the St. Catherine's Home for Children became the site of an unspeakable tragedy that would haunt investigators for over a century. What began as a catastrophic fire would reveal something far more sinister than a simple accident. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like on this video. This case requires us to examine documents that have been hidden for decades, testimonies that were suppressed, and evidence that challenges everything we think we know about what happened that winter night in the Arkansas wilderness. 37 children entered St. Catherine's in the fall of 1920. By Christmas, only 9 remained alive. The others vanished in ways that official records still cannot explain. In the autumn of 1920, the St. Catherine's Home for Children stood isolated in the Ouachita Mountains of western Arkansas, approximately 40 miles from the nearest town of Mena. The orphanage had been established in 1903 by the Sisters of Mercy, a Catholic order dedicated to caring for abandoned and orphaned children throughout the rural South. The facility itself was a 3-story wooden structure built in the Victorian style, surrounded by dense pine forests and accessible only by a single unpaved road that became impassable during heavy rains. According to records from the Polk County Historical Society, the orphanage housed between 30 and 40 children at any given time, ranging in age from 4 to 16 years old. The staff in December 1920 consisted of Mother Superior Agnes Blackwell, age 53, who had run the institution since 1911, 4 other nuns ranging in age from 26 to 62, a groundskeeper named Thomas Henley, age 47, and a cook, Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, age 39. Documents from the Diocese of Little Rock show that the orphanage operated on minimal funding, relying primarily on donations from Catholic parishes across Arkansas and occasional support from the state. The children themselves came from troubled circumstances. County records indicate that most had lost parents to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, while others had been surrendered by families too poor to care for them during the economic depression that followed World War I. What happened on the night of December 14, 1920, would be recorded as Arkansas's deadliest fire until the 1950s. But the official explanation of a kitchen fire spreading through the old wooden building never satisfied those who examined the evidence closely. Something else happened at St. Catherine's that night, something that left marks the fire alone cannot explain. According to the sworn testimony of Sheriff Clayton Morrison, preserved in the Polk County Court Archives, the first alarm was raised at approximately 2:47 a.m. on December 15, 1920. A local farmer named Jacob Thornton, whose property bordered the orphanage grounds 3 miles to the east, reported seeing an orange glow illuminating the night sky above the mountain ridge where St. Catherine's stood. Sheriff Morrison assembled a volunteer response team of 12 men from Mena and began the journey to the orphanage. The December roads were frozen and their motor vehicles could only travel 8 of the 40 miles before the terrain became impassable. The men were forced to continue on horseback. Morrison's official report, filed with the Arkansas State Police on December 17, 1920, states that they arrived at the orphanage at approximately 6:15 a.m., more than 3 hours after the alarm was first raised. What they found defied immediate comprehension. The main building of St. Catherine's had been reduced to a smoldering skeleton of charred timber and collapsed floors. Smoke still rose from the ruins in thick columns that Morrison described as having an unusual, acrid quality that made several of his men physically ill. The December cold had done nothing to extinguish the fire's intensity. Parts of the structure were still burning, despite the below-freezing temperatures and the light snow that had fallen during the night. But it was the silence that Morrison noted most prominently in his report. He wrote that the scene possessed an oppressive, unnatural quiet. No birds sang. No sounds emerged from the surrounding forest. Even the horses that had carried the rescue party became agitated and difficult to control as they approached the ruins. The initial search of the grounds revealed 9 survivors huddled in the groundskeeper's cottage, a small structure located approximately 100 yards from the main building. These survivors consisted of 7 children, Mother Superior Blackwell, and the groundskeeper Thomas Henley. According to Dr. James Whitmore, the physician who examined them later that day at Mina General Hospital, all 9 displayed signs of severe psychological trauma that went beyond what one would expect from fire survivors. Dr. Whitmore's medical report, preserved in the hospital's archives, notes several disturbing details. The survivors exhibited identical burn patterns on their hands and forearms, described as regular, almost geometric marks that did not match typical fire injuries. Several of the children had lost patches of hair that appeared to have been removed cleanly at the root, rather than singed by flames. Most significantly, all 9 survivors displayed what Whitmore termed complete retrograde amnesia regarding the events of the night. Mother Superior Blackwell, when questioned by Sheriff Morrison on December 16th, could provide no coherent account of how the fire started or how she and the others escaped. The transcript of this interview, held in the Arkansas State Archives, shows a woman in profound psychological distress. She repeatedly stated that she could remember putting the children to bed at 8:30 p.m., and her next memory was waking in the groundskeeper's cottage at dawn with no recollection of the intervening hours. The 7 surviving children, when interviewed separately by both Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Whitmore, provided accounts that were disturbingly similar in their vagueness. Each child remembered going to sleep in their dormitory beds. Each remembered dreaming of music, described as resembling a music box or children's lullaby. And each remembered waking in the cottage with no memory of leaving the burning building. Thomas Henley, the groundskeeper, provided the only testimony that suggested something beyond a simple fire. In his statement to Sheriff Morrison, recorded on December 18th and preserved in county records, Henley claimed he had been awakened in his cottage by the sound of children singing. He stated that he opened his cottage door to investigate and saw figures moving between the trees in the forest surrounding the orphanage. When pressed for details, Henley described these figures as too tall to be children, moving with an unusual gait that he struggled to articulate. According to Henley's testimony, he approached the main building to investigate and found the front entrance standing open. Smoke was already visible through the upper windows. He stated that he entered the building and began searching for the children and staff, but found the interior strangely empty despite the late hour. The dormitories on the 2nd floor were vacant, the beds disturbed but unoccupied. Henley's account becomes less coherent at this point. He claimed to have heard singing coming from the basement, which he described as the voices of many children harmonizing together. When he attempted to descend the basement stairs, he found them blocked by what he initially believed was smoke, but which he later described as something thicker, more substantial, that seemed to push against him with physical force. His next clear memory was waking in his cottage as dawn broke, surrounded by the 9 survivors, with no recollection of how any of them had arrived there. The recovery of remains began on December 16th and continued for 6 days. According to the official report filed by Coroner Hugh Davenport, 28 bodies were eventually recovered from the ruins. The report, stored in the Polk County Records Office, contains several elements that contemporary investigators found deeply troubling. First, the distribution of the bodies made no logical sense. Davenport noted that most of the remains were discovered in the basement of the building, despite the fact that the children's dormitories were located on the 2nd floor. No bodies were found in the dormitories themselves, nor on the main staircase that would have been the natural escape route. Second, the condition of the remains was inconsistent with death by fire. While badly burned, several bodies showed evidence of trauma that preceded the fire. Davenport's report specifically mentions fractures, missing extremities, and positioning that suggested violent struggle. Most disturbing was his notation that 12 of the 28 bodies appeared to have been arranged in a circular pattern in the basement, a detail he struggled to explain through any natural fire progression. Third, and most significantly, the count did not match. The orphanage records, maintained meticulously by Mother Superior Blackwell and confirmed by the Diocese of Little Rock, showed 37 children in residence on December 14th, 1920. 9 children survived. 28 bodies were recovered. This left a discrepancy that Sheriff Morrison noted in his report, but could never resolve. In the days following the fire, search parties combed the surrounding forest for any trace of missing bodies or survivors. Volunteers from MENA and surrounding communities, along with state police officers, searched in expanding circles around the orphanage ruins for 2 weeks. According to records maintained by the Polk County Sheriff's Department, they found no additional remains. What they did find raised questions that the official investigation chose not to pursue. Multiple search party members reported discovering unusual markings on trees in the forest surrounding St. Catherine's. These markings, described in various witness statements as symbols or characters carved deeply into the bark, formed rough circles at distances of approximately 1 mile from the orphanage in all directions. Photographs were taken by Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb, though these photographs were later reported lost in a fire at the sheriff's office in 1923. Several searchers reported finding children's belongings scattered throughout the forest, items that appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than discarded randomly. A child's shoe on a tree stump, a doll positioned upright against a boulder, a small Bible opened to a specific page and weighted down with stones to prevent the wind from closing it. Most disturbing were the reports, documented in statements from at least 7 different searchers, of finding areas of the forest where the ground appeared disturbed, as if something had been buried and then exhumed. Deputy Webb investigated these sites and confirmed that the soil had been recently displaced, but his excavations revealed nothing. The official investigation concluded on January 12, 1921. Coroner Davenport ruled the deaths as accidental, caused by a kitchen fire that spread rapidly through the old wooden structure. The discrepancy in the body count was attributed to record-keeping errors. The strange testimony of Thomas Henley was dismissed as the confused recollections of a traumatized man. The amnesia of the survivors was explained as a common psychological response to extreme trauma. The case was closed. St. Catherine's Orphanage was not rebuilt. The land was sold to a timber company in 1923 and remained undeveloped for decades. The 9 survivors were relocated to other facilities. Mother Superior Blackwell retired from the order in 1922 and died in 1931. Thomas Henley left Arkansas within months of the fire, and his subsequent whereabouts were never recorded. The official explanation satisfied the authorities, but it did not satisfy everyone who examined the evidence, and it certainly did not explain what would begin happening in the Arkansas mountains in the decades that followed. The official closure of the St. Catherine's case did not end the questions surrounding the fire. Documents housed at the University of Arkansas Special Collections reveal that several individuals pursued independent investigations in the months and years following the tragedy, uncovering inconsistencies that the official inquiry had overlooked or deliberately ignored. The most persistent of these early investigators was Father Michael Corrigan, a priest from the Diocese of Little Rock who had visited St. Catherine's multiple times between 1918 and 1920. Father Corrigan's personal journals donated to the Catholic Historical Society of Arkansas in 1967 contain detailed observations about his concerns regarding the official investigation. In an entry dated February 3, 1921, Father Corrigan wrote that he had obtained permission from the diocese to review the orphanage's records that had been salvaged from a fireproof safe in the ruins. According to his journal, these records revealed several troubling details that contradicted the official timeline. The attendance logs showed that all 37 children had been present and accounted for at evening prayers on December 14th at 8 GUX p.m. Mother Superior Blackwell's daily journal, written in her distinctive hand, contained a final entry for that date, noting that all children were in good health and spirits. But Father Corrigan noted a peculiar detail that had been overlooked. In the margins of the final entry, written in what appeared to be a different pen and possibly a shaking hand, were the words in Latin, Audivi cantum in sylvis, which translates to I heard singing in the woods. This notation was never mentioned in any official report. Father Corrigan attempted to interview the survivors in early 1921. According to his journal entries from March 1921, he was granted limited access to speak with 3 of the surviving children who had been relocated to an orphanage in Fort Smith. His notes from these interviews, preserved in his journals, paint a disturbing picture. The first child, identified only as Margaret S., age 9 in Corrigan's notes, initially claimed to remember nothing of the fire. However, after extended conversation, she began describing a recurring nightmare she had experienced every night since the incident. In this dream, she recalled walking through the forest at night, following a line of other children. She described the trees as being marked with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Most disturbing was her description of reaching a clearing where someone was waiting, though she could never remember who or what this figure was. The second child, Thomas R., age 11, provided similar accounts of dreams involving nighttime walks through the forest. According to Father Corrigan's notes, the boy became extremely agitated when asked about the basement of the orphanage, stating repeatedly that they went down to sing, but refusing to elaborate on who they were or why they went to the basement. The third child, Elizabeth M., age 14, the oldest of the survivors Father Corrigan interviewed, provided the most detailed account. She told Father Corrigan that she remembered waking on the night of the fire to the sound of music coming from outside. She described seeing other children rising from their beds and walking toward the dormitory door as if in a trance. She claimed she tried to wake her roommate, but found the girl unresponsive, despite having her eyes open. Elizabeth stated that she remembered following the other children down the stairs and out of the building, though she had no voluntary control over her movements. She described walking into the forest and seeing figures standing among the trees, figures she described as too tall and too thin. Her account ends with a memory of descending stairs into darkness while singing a song she had never heard before, and then nothing until waking in the groundskeeper's cottage at dawn. Father Corrigan attempted to bring these testimonies to the attention of Sheriff Morrison and the Arkansas State Police in April 1921. According to correspondence preserved in the diocese archives, his concerns were dismissed. A letter from State Police Captain Raymond Foster, dated April 18, 1921, states that the children's accounts were clearly the result of traumatic nightmares and held no evidentiary value. Frustrated but undeterred, Father Corrigan decided to conduct his own examination of the orphanage site. His journal entry from May 7, 1921, describes his visit to the ruins. He brought with him a camera and took numerous photographs of the site, including images of the tree markings that search parties had reported. Father Corrigan's photographs, preserved in the diocese archives, show symbols carved deeply into the bark of pine trees surrounding the former orphanage. The symbols appear to be a mixture of geometric patterns and what Corrigan identified as possible alchemical or occult markings. Most significantly, his photographs documented that these symbols were not random vandalism, but formed a deliberate pattern, with similar markings appearing at regular intervals, forming a rough circle approximately 1 mile in diameter around the orphanage site. In his journal, Father Corrigan noted that he felt profound unease while photographing the site. He wrote that the forest seemed unnaturally quiet and that he experienced a persistent feeling of being observed. Most disturbing was his notation that he found what appeared to be relatively fresh disturbances in the soil at various locations within the tree circle, despite the fact that the fire had occurred 5 months earlier and the site had been thoroughly searched. Father Corrigan's investigation took a darker turn in late May 1921. According to his journal entries, he began researching the history of the land on which St. Catherine's had been built. Records at the Polk County Courthouse revealed that the property had changed hands multiple times before being purchased by the diocese in 1902. Prior to that, it had been owned by a private individual named Ezekiel Marsh, who had lived on the property with his family from 1887 until his death in 1901. Father Corrigan discovered through local historical records that Marsh had been a controversial figure in the area. Newspaper articles from the Mena Star, published between 1895 and 1900, described Marsh as a recluse who claimed to be conducting scientific experiments on his mountain property. Several articles mentioned complaints from neighbors about strange sounds and lights seen on the property at night, and about Marsh's requests for local families to send their children to his property for what he described as educational purposes. More significantly, Father Corrigan uncovered an article from October 1899 describing an investigation by local authorities into allegations that several children who had visited Marsh's property had returned, changed, exhibiting strange behaviors and speaking in languages their families claimed they had never been taught. The investigation, according to the article, was dropped after Marsh threatened legal action and produced written consent from the children's parents for their visits. Ezekiel Marsh's death in 1901 was recorded as accidental, the result of a fall on his property. Father Corrigan noted in his journal that he could find no record of what happened to Marsh's belongings or any documents related to his supposed experiments. The property stood vacant for nearly a year before being sold to the diocese. Father Corrigan's final journal entries regarding St. Catherine's are dated June 1921. In an entry from June 14th, he wrote that he had decided to conduct one final visit to the site, this time at night, to investigate reports from locals that strange lights and sounds had been observed near the ruins. He wrote that he planned to bring blessed candles and sacred texts as protection. There is no subsequent entry describing this night visit. In fact, Father Corrigan's journal entries cease entirely after June 14, 1921, resuming only briefly in September 1921 with short cryptic notations about his duties at the diocese. Correspondence from his superiors, preserved in the diocese archives, indicates that Father Corrigan requested and was granted a leave of absence in July 1921 for reasons of health. He never returned to active ministry and died in 1927 at the age of 46 from what medical records describe as a rapid decline in both physical and mental health. The unofficial investigation of St. Catherine's might have ended with Father Corrigan's departure had it not been for the emergence of another concerned party. In late 1921, a journalist named Sarah Winters, working for the Arkansas Gazette in Little Rock, began her own inquiry into the orphanage fire. Winters' personal papers, donated to the Arkansas State Archives in 1952, reveal that she had become interested in the case after receiving an anonymous letter in November 1921. This letter, preserved in her papers, claimed that the official investigation had overlooked crucial evidence and urged her to interview Thomas Henley, the groundskeeper who had relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. Winters traveled to Memphis in December 1921 and succeeded in interviewing Henley. Her handwritten notes from this interview paint a picture of a deeply traumatized man who was reluctant to discuss the events of that night. However, over the course of several meetings, Henley provided Winters with details he had not shared with official investigators. According to Winters' notes, Henley revealed that in the weeks leading up to the fire, he had observed unusual activities around the orphanage. He claimed that on multiple occasions, he had seen Mother Superior Blackwell walking into the forest late at night, sometimes accompanied by one or two of the older children. When he questioned her about these excursions, she told him she was taking the children for evening prayers in nature. Henley also told Winters that he had discovered a hidden room in the basement of the orphanage approximately 2 weeks before the fire. This room, which he described as being accessible through a concealed door behind shelving in the main basement storage area, contained what he characterized as disturbing materials including old journals, unusual instruments that appeared to be both scientific and ritualistic in nature, and diagrams or maps of the surrounding forest with the tree symbols marked on them. Most significantly, Henley claimed that when he reported this discovery to Mother Superior Blackwell, she became extremely agitated and forbade him from entering that room again or mentioning its existence to anyone. Henley stated that he complied with her wishes, but that the discovery had deeply troubled him. Winters attempted to verify Henley's claims by examining the architectural plans for St. Catherine's, which she obtained from the Diocese of Little Rock. According to her notes, the plans showed no hidden room in the basement. However, she noted that the plans dated from 1903 and that there were indications of later modifications to the structure that were not documented in the original drawings. Sarah Winters published a series of articles about the St. Catherine's fire in the Arkansas Gazette between January and March 1922. These articles, preserved in the newspaper's archives, raised serious questions about the official investigation and called for the case to be reopened. The articles generated significant public interest and some controversy, particularly with the diocese and local authorities who felt that Winters was sensationalizing a tragedy. The diocese issued a formal statement in April 1922, preserved in their records, expressing disappointment with the Gazette's coverage and asserting that the newspaper was irresponsibly disturbing the peace of the survivors and the families of the deceased. Shortly thereafter, the Gazette ceased publishing articles about St. Catherine's. Winters' personal correspondence from this period, found in her papers, reveals that she received pressure from multiple sources to drop the story. More troubling are letters dated May 1922 in which she mentions receiving anonymous warnings to cease her investigation. One such letter, preserved in her files, contained only a crude drawing of the symbols that had been found on the trees near the orphanage site. Sarah Winters. Investigation ended abruptly in June 1922. According to newspaper reports from the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Winters was found dead in her hotel room in Memphis on June 8, 1922. The cause of death was ruled as suicide by overdose of sleeping medication. However, several details troubled those who knew her. Her editor at the Arkansas Gazette wrote in a private letter, preserved in the newspaper's archives, that Winters had shown no signs of depression and had, in fact, been enthusiastic about pursuing new leads in the St. Catherine's case just days before her death. More significantly, when Winters' belongings were returned to her family, her extensive notes and documentation regarding the St. Catherine's investigation were missing. Her family reported this to police, but the materials were never recovered. By late 1922, the St. Catherine's fire had faded from public attention. The surviving children had been absorbed into other institutions. The land had been sold. Those who had asked too many questions had either been silenced or had vanished. The official narrative remained unchanged. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The St. Catherine's case remained largely dormant in the historical record until 1967, when it captured the attention of Dr. Richard Ashford, a professor of American history at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. Dr. Ashford's interest in the case began almost by accident, according to his correspondence, preserved in the university's special collections. In September 1967, Dr. Ashford was conducting research for a book on rural institutions in early 20th century Arkansas when he came across a brief mention of the St. Catherine's fire in a 1921 church record. Intrigued by the few details provided, he began what would become a 7-year investigation into the case, an investigation that would consume his professional life and ultimately cost him far more than his career. Dr. Ashford's first significant discovery came in early 1968, when he located Father Michael Corrigan's journals in the Catholic Historical Society of Arkansas archives. According to Ashford's research notes, dated March 1968, he was immediately struck by the discrepancies between Father Corrigan's observations and the official investigation's conclusions. The journalist Sarah Winters' papers, which Ashford discovered at the Arkansas State Archives in May 1968, further convinced him that the truth about St. Catherine's had been deliberately suppressed. What set Dr. Ashford apart from earlier investigators was his methodological approach. Rather than focusing solely on the fire itself, Ashford began researching the complete history of the property, the surrounding area, and the people connected to the orphanage. His research files, which fill 23 archive boxes at the University of Arkansas, reveal a picture far more complex and disturbing than anyone had previously uncovered. Ashford's breakthrough came in November 1968, when he discovered documents related to Ezekiel Marsh, the previous owner of the property. Through extensive searching of county records, university archives, and even records of scientific societies from the late 19th century, Ashford pieced together a portrait of a man whose activities went far beyond simple eccentricity. According to documents that Ashford uncovered at the Library of Congress, Ezekiel Marsh had been a trained chemist and physicist who had studied in Europe during the 1870s and early 1880s. Marsh had published several papers in obscure scientific journals during this period, papers that Ashford tracked down with considerable effort. These papers, preserved in Ashford's research files, dealt with topics that straddled the line between legitimate science and pseudoscience, including studies of electromagnetic fields, theories about consciousness and its relationship to physical space, and experiments in what Marsh termed psychic resonance. Most significantly, Ashford discovered correspondence between Marsh and several European scientists who were involved in what would now be considered occult research. Letters dated between 1885 and 1887, which Ashford found in a collection of papers at Yale University's Beinecke Library, show Marsh discussing plans to create what he called a locus of heightened perceptual awareness through the strategic placement of electromagnetic generators in a specific geographical pattern. Ashford's notes from December 1968 reveal his growing realization that the symbols carved on trees around the St. Catherine's site were not random occult markings, but rather location markers for some kind of deliberate arrangement. Using Father Corrigan's photographs and his own surveys of the site, Ashford created a map showing that the symbols formed not just a circle, but a complex geometric pattern with the orphanage location at its precise center. In early 1969, Ashford made what he considered his most significant discovery. While searching through boxes of miscellaneous documents at the Polk County Courthouse that had been stored in a basement and largely forgotten, he found a leather-bound journal that bore no identification but whose handwriting matched samples of Ezekiel Marsh's writing that Ashford had found in other documents. This journal, which Ashford describes in detail in his research notes from February 1969, contained what appeared to be daily observations from Marsh's experiments conducted between 1896 and 1900. The entries describe Marsh's attempts to create what he termed apertures or thresholds through which what he called the other awareness could manifest in physical space. Marsh's methodology, as described in the journal, involved bringing subjects, primarily children, whom he believed possessed more permeable consciousness, to specific locations within his geometric pattern. At these locations, the subjects would be exposed to electromagnetic fields generated by devices Marsh had constructed, while being instructed to enter meditative or trance states. Marsh wrote extensively about his theory that young minds could serve as anchors or beacons for intelligences that existed in what he described as adjacent layers of reality. The journal entries become increasingly disturbing as they progress. Marsh wrote about achieving partial successes in which subjects reported experiencing visions, hearing voices, or sensing presences that were not physically visible. He described these experiences as proof that his theories were correct and that he was approaching a breakthrough in human understanding of consciousness and reality. But the final entries in the journal, dated from August to October 1900, suggest that something went catastrophically wrong with Marsh's experiments. The writing becomes increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher. Marsh writes about subjects who did not return to normal consciousness after sessions, about sounds and movements in the forest that he could not explain, and about his growing conviction that he had succeeded in creating an aperture but could not control what came through it. The journal's final entry, dated October 28, 1900, consists of a single sentence written in large, shaking letters across 2 pages. "They are here and they are hungry, and I cannot close what I have opened." According to Ashford's notes, he found this journal deeply disturbing, but also recognized its potential significance. He immediately began trying to verify the information it contained. His research over the following months confirmed many of Marsh's biographical details and established that several children from local families had indeed visited Marsh's property during the period described in the journal. More significantly, Ashford discovered through obituary records and cemetery inscriptions that at least 6 children from the Mina area had died under unusual circumstances between 1897 and 1900. The causes of death listed in medical records, which Ashford obtained from county archives, included seizures, unexplained fevers, and in 2 cases, what 19th-century physicians termed acute melancholia, resulting in self-harm. All 6 children had been known to have visited Ezekiel Marsh's property. By mid-1969, Ashford had compiled enough material to begin writing what he intended to be a comprehensive academic paper on the St. Catherine's fire and its connection to Marsh's earlier activities. However, according to his correspondence from this period, he felt he needed to conduct on-site research at the location itself to fully understand the spatial relationships described in Marsh's journal. Ashford's first visit to the St. Catherine's site occurred in July 1969. Accompanied by two graduate students, James Morton and Patricia Delacroix, Ashford spent 3 days surveying the location, taking photographs and attempting to locate the positions of Marsh's alleged electromagnetic generators, which according to the journal had been buried at specific points within the geometric pattern. The field notes from this expedition, preserved in Ashford's research files, document several unusual findings. Using a metal detector, the team located what appeared to be iron objects buried approximately 3 feet deep at several locations that corresponded to the tree symbols. Due to the difficulty of excavation in the Rocky Mountain soil, they were only able to fully unearth one of these objects. The object, which Ashford photographed extensively and described in detail, was a cylindrical iron device approximately 18 inches long and 6 inches in diameter. It was heavily corroded, but appeared to be of sophisticated construction, with internal components visible through degraded sections. Ashford's notes indicate that the device had coiled wiring inside and what appeared to be chambers that might have held some kind of chemical or electrical charge. The object matched descriptions in Marsh's journal of the generators he had constructed. More disturbing than the device itself was the condition of the soil immediately surrounding it. Patricia Delacroix, who had training in archaeology, noted in her field observations that the soil showed signs of having been disturbed long after the device was buried. Her notes describe finding what appeared to be root systems that had grown in unusual patterns around the device, forming shapes she described as almost deliberate in their arrangement. During this same expedition, the team documented that many of the symbols carved on trees in 1920 or earlier were still visible, though weathered. They also noted that new carvings had appeared on several trees, crude reproductions of the original symbols that appeared to be only a few years old. Ashford photographed these new carvings and noted in his field journal that their existence suggested others had discovered the site and recognized the significance of the original markings. On the third night of their expedition, July 19, 1969, the research team experienced what Ashford described in his notes as an unexplainable incident. According to the accounts written separately by all 3 team members, they were awakened around 2:30 a.m. by what they initially thought was wind moving through the trees. However, as they became fully conscious, they realized the sound had a musical quality to it, resembling multiple voices singing in harmony. James Morton's account, written the following morning, describes leaving his tent to investigate and seeing unusual lights moving through the forest approximately 100 yards from their camp. He described these lights as having a bluish-white color and moving with purpose rather than flickering randomly like fireflies or flashlights. When he called to his companions, the lights immediately vanished and the singing sound ceased abruptly. All 3 researchers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of unease following this incident. According to Ashford's notes, they packed their equipment and left the site the following morning, several hours earlier than planned. In his research journal, Ashford wrote that the experience had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and that he now believed the site retained some kind of active presence related to Marsh's experiments. Despite, or perhaps because of this unsettling experience, Ashford became more determined than ever to uncover the complete truth about St. Catherine's. Over the following months, he worked obsessively on his research, often to the detriment of his other academic responsibilities. Correspondence between Ashford and the university administration from late 1969 and early 1970 shows growing concern about his neglect of his teaching duties and his increasing fixation on what colleagues viewed as a fringe topic. In January 1970, Ashford made another significant discovery. While researching newspaper archives from the 1920s through the 1950s, He found multiple reports of unusual incidents in the Ouachita Mountains in the general vicinity of the former St. Catherine's property. These incidents, documented in papers from Mena, Fort Smith, and Little Rock, included disappearances of hikers, reports of strange sounds and lights, and several cases of individuals found wandering in the forest in confused mental states. What struck Ashford as significant was the timing of these incidents. According to his analysis, documented in a research memo from February 1970, there appeared to be a cyclical pattern to the reports, with clusters of incidents occurring at approximately 7-year intervals: 1927, 1928, 1934, 1935, 1941, 1942, 1948, 1949, 1955, 1956, 1962, 1963, and potentially beginning again in 1969 to 1970. Most disturbing was Ashford's discovery that in each of these periods, at least one person had disappeared entirely in the area near the former orphanage site. In several cases, search parties had found no trace of the missing individuals, despite extensive efforts. In other cases, remains had been discovered months or years later, in locations that searchers insisted they had thoroughly checked. Ashford's research notes from March 1970 reveal his theory that Marsh's experiments had created some kind of permanent instability or opening that manifested periodically, perhaps triggered by astronomical or geomagnetic factors. He began corresponding with physicists and researchers in anomalous phenomena, attempting to find scientific frameworks that might explain his findings. However, Ashford's academic colleagues were becoming increasingly concerned about the direction of his work. Internal university memos from spring 1970, preserved in the university archives, show faculty members questioning whether Ashford's research had crossed the line from legitimate historical inquiry into pseudoscientific speculation. There were discussions about whether his work might damage the university's reputation. Despite these concerns, Ashford pressed forward. In May 1970, he submitted a paper titled "The St. Catherine's Anomaly: Historical Evidence for Persistent Spatial Distortion in the Ouachita Mountains" to the Journal of American History. The paper was rejected, with reviewers noting that while Ashford's historical research was thorough, his conclusions were not supported by the evidence and ventured into territory inappropriate for an academic journal. Undeterred, Ashford began preparing a book-length treatment of his findings. According to his correspondence from summer 1970, he also began planning another expedition to the St. Catherine's site, this time equipped with more sophisticated detection equipment and prepared to conduct a more extensive excavation of the locations where Marsh's generators were buried. This second expedition was scheduled for September 1970. Ashford arranged to be accompanied by Dr. Patricia Delacroix, who had been part of the first expedition and had continued to assist with his research, and by Dr. Robert Chen, a physicist from MIT who had become interested in Ashford's theories about electromagnetic anomalies at the site. The expedition departed for the St. Catherine's site on September 12, 1970. According to the plan filed with the university and shared with Ashford's family, they intended to spend 5 days conducting research at the location. They were equipped with camping gear, research, equipment including electromagnetic field detectors and portable seismographs, and two-way radios for emergency communication. When the team failed to return by September 18th as scheduled, university officials contacted the Arkansas State Police. A search and rescue operation began on September 19th. According to the official report filed by the Arkansas State Police, searchers found the team's campsite intact at the St. Catherine's location on September 20th. The tents were properly erected, supplies were undisturbed, and equipment was still functioning. But there was no sign of Dr. Ashford, Dr. Delacroix, or Dr. Chen. The search continued for 3 weeks, involving state police, Forest Service personnel, volunteers, and even a National Guard helicopter. The official report, preserved in state police archives, documents that searchers covered a radius of 20 miles around the campsite. They found no trace of the missing researchers. Most puzzling were several details noted in the search report. The research team's vehicle was found parked at the access road where they had left it, keys still in the ignition. Their personal belongings, including wallets and identification, were found in their tents. Most significantly, Dr. Ashford's research notes and journals were found neatly stacked in his tent, but his most recent entries were missing. According to the search report, the last entry in Ashford's field journal was dated September 13th, yet the team had been at the site for at least 2 more days based on other evidence. The search was officially suspended on October 11, 1970. The 3 researchers were eventually declared legally dead in 1977. Their bodies were never found. The University of Arkansas quietly closed its investigation into the incident. Ashford's compiled research materials, including all his files on St. Catherine's and Ezekiel Marsh, were boxed and stored in the university's archives with restricted access. According to internal memos from late 1970, preserved in the university's administrative files, there was concern that publicizing the details of Ashford's disappearance might encourage others to visit the site and potentially place themselves in danger. Dr. Richard Ashford's disappearance effectively ended serious academic inquiry into the St. Catherine's case for many years. His fate served as a warning to others who might have considered investigating the incident. The case returned to obscurity, mentioned only occasionally in books about Arkansas mysteries or unsolved disappearances. But the St. Catherine's site itself did not remain quiet, and in the decades that followed, evidence would emerge suggesting that whatever had claimed the lives of 37 children in 1920 and 3 researchers in 1970 was still active in the Arkansas mountains. The St. Catherine's site remained largely undisturbed through the 1970s and early 1980s, but this period of quiet ended dramatically in 1987. According to reports filed with the Ouachita National Forest Service, preserved in their incident archives, park rangers began receiving an unusual number of reports from hikers and campers in the area surrounding the former orphanage location. Ranger Thomas Blackwood, stationed at the Mena District Office, documented the first significant incident in his log on June 14, 1987. According to his report, 2 experienced hikers, David and Susan Carmichael from Dallas, Texas, reported becoming disoriented while hiking trails in the area. The couple stated that they had been following a well-marked trail when they heard what sounded like children singing in the distance. Curious about the source of the sound, they moved off-trail to investigate. According to their statement given to Ranger Blackwood and preserved in Forest Service files, they walked for approximately 15 minutes before realizing they had completely lost their bearings. The singing had stopped, and they found themselves in an area of forest they described as unnaturally silent and oppressive. Most significantly, Susan Carmichael reported seeing symbols carved on trees that she photographed with her camera. When the couple eventually found their way back to the trail, several hours later than expected, they reported the incident to park authorities. The photographs Mrs. Carmichael took, copies of which are filed with the Ranger report, clearly show symbols matching those documented at the St. Catherine's site in earlier investigations. Ranger Blackwood investigated the area described by the Carmichaels on June 16, 1987. His report notes that he was able to locate the trees with the symbols, confirming that they were in the vicinity of the former St. Catherine's Orphanage site, approximately 2 miles from the nearest marked trail. More disturbing was his notation that the symbols appeared to have been recently recarved or refreshed, despite the remoteness of the location and the lack of any legitimate reason for individuals to be marking trees in this area. Over the following months, similar reports accumulated in Forest Service files. Between June and October 1987, 8 separate groups of hikers reported hearing singing or music in the forest, becoming disoriented and discovering the carved symbols. 3 of these groups reported seeing lights moving through the trees at night. In 2 cases, hikers reported encountering areas where their compasses began behaving erratically, spinning without settling on a consistent direction. The Forest Service took these reports seriously enough to conduct a thorough survey of the area in November 1987. According to the survey report, filed by District Ranger Michael Patterson and preserved in Forest Service archives, the team documented symbol carvings on approximately 40 trees within a 2-mile radius of the former orphanage site. While some of these carvings were weathered and clearly decades old, others appeared fresh, made within the past few years. More significantly, the survey team reported experiencing equipment malfunctions while working in the area. 2 compasses showed erratic behavior. A radio used for communication with base camp produced unusual interference that technicians later could not explain. And multiple team members reported feeling what Patterson's report describes as acute unease and the sensation of being observed while working at the site. Based on these findings, the Forest Service posted warning signs on trails in the area, advising hikers to stay on marked paths. However, according to incident reports from 1988 and 1989, the warnings seemed to have little effect on the frequency of unusual occurrences. The case attracted renewed attention in 1991 when a Little Rock television station, KATV, aired a special segment about unexplained phenomena in Arkansas. The segment, titled Arkansas Mysteries, included a 12-minute feature on the St. Catherine's Orphanage and the subsequent strange occurrences in the area. The broadcast, preserved in the station's archives, included interviews with hikers who had experienced unusual incidents and with local historians familiar with the case. Most significantly, the program interviewed Margaret Sullivan, identified as one of the surviving children from the 1920 fire. Sullivan, who was 74 years old at the time of the interview, had never previously spoken publicly about her experiences. Her interview, conducted at her home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, provided the first detailed survivor testimony since the immediate aftermath of the fire. According to the broadcast transcript, Sullivan stated that she had carried memories of that night for her entire life, memories that differed significantly from the amnesia reported by authorities in 1920. She described remembering walking through the forest at night, following other children who seemed to be in a trance. She recalled reaching a clearing where she saw figures she could not adequately describe, figures she characterized as wrong in their proportions and movements. Most chilling was Sullivan's description of going down into the earth, into what she believed was the basement of the orphanage, though she could not be certain of the location. She described the other children singing, their voices harmonizing in a way that seemed impossible for untrained children to achieve. And she described a presence in that underground space, something she could sense but not see, something that was aware of them and hungry for them. Sullivan stated that her next clear memory was waking in the groundskeeper's cottage at dawn. She said she had never spoken of these memories because when she tried to tell authorities in 1920, she was told she was confused and traumatized, and that her memories were nightmares, not reality. She had eventually convinced herself that this must be true, but the nightmares had continued throughout her life, always the same, walking through the forest, singing in the darkness, and something reaching for her from beyond sight. The television broadcast generated significant public interest and led to increased visitation to the St. Catherine's area by curiosity seekers and amateur investigators. This in turn led to more reports of unusual experiences. Forest Service incident logs from 1991 through 1994, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests by researchers, document dozens of reports ranging from disorientation and equipment malfunction to more dramatic claims of seeing apparitions and hearing voices. In 1995, the case attracted the attention of Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a professor of psychology at the University of Texas, specializing in group phenomena and collective experiences. Dr. Martinez, who had read about the St. Catherine's case and was intrigued by the patterns of reported experiences, received a grant to conduct a systematic study of individuals who reported unusual experiences at the site. Dr. Martinez's research, published in the Journal of Anomalous Experience in 1997, analyzed interviews with 47 individuals who reported experiencing unusual phenomena in the St. Catherine's area between 1987 and 1996. According to her paper titled Collective Experience Patterns in Geographic-Specific Anomalous Reports, several consistent elements emerged from the testimonies. 73% of subjects reported hearing music or singing described consistently as resembling children's voices in harmony. 68% reported experiencing sudden disorientation and loss of navigational ability. 51% reported seeing unusual lights in the forest, and 42% reported encountering carved symbols on trees. Most significantly for Dr. Martinez's research, many subjects reported experiencing what she termed shared hallucinations. Multiple individuals who were together at the time of their experiences reported seeing or hearing identical things, suggesting that whatever was occurring was not purely subjective psychological phenomena. Dr. Martinez's paper carefully avoided drawing conclusions about the supernatural nature of these experiences, instead framing them as an interesting case study in how environmental factors, suggestion, and group psychology might create consistent anomalous experiences. However, in her private research notes, donated to the University of Texas Archives in 2015, she expressed more personal concerns about what she had discovered. In notes dated August 1996, Dr. Martinez wrote that during a research visit to the St. Catherine's site, she had personally experienced many of the phenomena reported by her subjects. She described hearing music that seemed to have no source, seeing lights moving through the trees in ways inconsistent with any natural explanation, and experiencing a profound sense of dread that made her leave the site earlier than planned. More disturbing were her notes describing dreams she experienced for weeks after her visit. She wrote about dreaming of children walking through a forest at night, of descending stairs into darkness, and of something waiting in that darkness that was neither human nor entirely inhuman. These dreams matched descriptions provided by several of her interview subjects and bore striking similarities to the account given by Margaret Sullivan in her 1991 television interview. Dr. Martinez conducted one follow-up visit to the site in September 1996, accompanied by a videographer to document the location. The videotape from this visit, preserved in her research archives, shows Martinez walking through the forest, pointing out carved symbols and describing the layout of the area. The video quality is generally clear, but at several points, roughly 10 minutes into the recording, the image becomes distorted with horizontal lines and static that the videographer later stated he could not explain, as the equipment had functioned perfectly before and after the visit. More unsettling is what appears on the video during one of these periods of distortion. Between the static for approximately 7 seconds, unclear shapes are visible in the background of the shot, shapes that appear to be moving among the trees. Neither Dr. Martinez nor the videographer reported seeing anything unusual during the filming, and both stated in later interviews that they only became aware of these shapes when reviewing the footage. Dr. Martinez published no further research on the St. Catherine's case after 1997. When contacted by a researcher in 2003 about her work, she declined to discuss it, stating only that she had moved on to other projects and preferred not to revisit that particular case. The pattern of incidents at the St. Catherine's site has continued into the 21st century. Forest Service incident reports from 2001, 2008, and 2015, roughly following the 7-year cycle identified by Dr. Ashford in 1970, document clusters of unusual reports. Most recently, in 2022, the Ouachita National Forest Service temporarily closed several trails in the area after 3 separate groups of hikers within a 2-week period reported becoming severely disoriented and requiring rescue. One of these incidents, documented in a Forest Service report filed on October 8, 2022, involved a group of 4 college students from the University of Oklahoma who had gone hiking in the area specifically because they had heard about the St. Catherine's legend online. According to their statements, given to rescue personnel, the students followed an informal trail toward the location of the former orphanage site. The group's leader, identified in the report as Brandon Mitchell, age 21, stated that they reached what they believed was the site around 3 p.m. They spent approximately an hour exploring and taking photographs. Mitchell reported that as they prepared to leave, they heard what sounded like music coming from deeper in the forest. 3 members of the group heard this sound clearly, while the 4th member reported hearing nothing. Against the better judgment of one member, the group decided to investigate the source of the music. According to their statements, they walked for what they estimated was 10 to 15 minutes before realizing they had lost sight of any landmarks and could no longer determine which direction they had come from. Their cell phones, which had limited signal, showed GPS coordinates that placed them more than 5 miles from where they believed they were, though subsequent analysis suggested the GPS readings were incorrect. As darkness fell, the group attempted to return to the trail, but became increasingly disoriented. They reported that their flashlights began failing despite having fresh batteries. 2 members of the group reported seeing lights moving through the trees, lights they initially thought were from other hikers, but which moved in ways that seemed inconsistent with people carrying flashlights. The group spent the night in the forest, huddled together for warmth and safety. All 4 members reported that throughout the night, they heard sounds that resembled children singing, sometimes seemingly close by and sometimes distant. 3 of the 4 reported that during the darkest hours of the night, they saw figures moving between the trees, figures they described as too tall and moving too smoothly to be human. At dawn, the group was able to orient themselves and make their way back toward a trail, where they encountered a Forest Service search party that had been organized after they failed to return. Medical examination showed all 4 students to be suffering from exposure and dehydration, but otherwise physically unharmed. However, psychological evaluation at a local hospital noted that all 4 displayed signs of acute stress and that their descriptions of their experiences showed remarkable consistency, suggesting they had genuinely experienced something that terrified them. Most significantly, photographs taken by the students on their phones, copies of which were included in the Forest Service incident report, show the carved symbols on trees. They also show what appears to be a cleared area that matches historical descriptions of the former orphanage site, and in 3 photographs taken during the group's night in the forest, image analysis revealed anomalies that experts consulted by the Forest Service could not explain. Luminous areas among the trees that were not visible to the photographers at the time and that do not match any known natural phenomena or camera artifacts. Following this incident, the Forest Service conducted another survey of the area in November 2022. According to the report, filed by District Ranger Amanda Foster, the survey team documented that the carved symbols had been refreshed again, with clear evidence of recent carving on multiple trees. More disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be camping sites in areas far off any established trails, suggesting that people, for reasons the Forest Service could not determine, were spending extended time in the remote forest near the former orphanage site. The Forest Service report recommended continued monitoring of the area and consideration of more substantial restrictions on access. However, as of 2024, the trails remain open, and incidents continue to be reported. The St. Catherine's site remains a location where the boundary between historical tragedy and ongoing mystery remains disturbingly thin. Local authorities in Mena and the surrounding Polk County area have become increasingly concerned about the number of people seeking out the St. Catherine's site. Sheriff's Department records from 2023, obtained through public records requests, show that deputies have been called multiple times to assist lost or disoriented hikers in the area. In at least 2 cases, individuals were found in states of extreme confusion, unable to explain how they had become so thoroughly lost in areas they claimed to have been carefully navigating. Most recently, in March 2024, a drone operator filming footage of the Ouachita Mountains for a documentary project captured unusual imagery in the area of the former St. Catherine's site. The footage, which was shared with Forest Service officials and has been analyzed by multiple experts, shows what appears to be a circular clearing in the forest where trees do not grow, matching the location of the orphanage based on historical maps. More intriguing is what appears in approximately 30 seconds of the footage. Lights visible among the trees surrounding the clearing, lights that pulse with a rhythmic pattern and that appear to move with coordinated purpose. The drone operator, in a statement to authorities, insisted that he saw nothing unusual while operating the drone and that the lights were only visible when reviewing the footage. Multiple analysts have examined the video and confirmed that the lights are present in the raw footage and are not the result of editing or camera malfunction, though no one has been able to determine what the lights actually are. The accumulation of evidence from nearly 40 years of documented modern incidents paints a disturbing picture. Whatever happened at St. Catherine's in 1920, whatever Ezekiel Marsh may have unleashed through his experiments in the 1890s, appears to remain active in the Arkansas mountains. The patterns are consistent: disorientation, unusual sounds, lights in the forest, and the persistent carved symbols marking trees in the area. Perhaps most troubling is the apparent 7-year cycle of intensified activity, a pattern that, if it holds true, suggests another period of increased incidents may be approaching in 2029. Forest Service officials, while maintaining publicly that the area is safe for experienced hikers who stay on marked trails, have privately expressed concern about what that year might bring. The St. Catherine's site stands as a stark reminder that some places bear scars that do not heal with time, and some tragedies leave marks that remain active, dangerous, and hungry for decades after the original victims have been forgotten by all but the most dedicated researchers and the most unfortunate wanderers. The St. Catherine's Home for Children fire of 1920 remains officially classified as a tragic accident resulting from a kitchen fire in an old wooden building. The deaths of 28 children are recorded in Arkansas vital statistics records. The disappearance of the others is attributed to record-keeping errors. The case is closed. But the evidence tells a different story, from Ezekiel Marsh's experiments in the 1890s to the Orphanage fire in 1920, from Father Corrigan's investigation in 1921 to Dr. Ashford's disappearance in 1970, from Margaret Sullivan's testimony in 1991 to the drone footage captured in 2024, a pattern emerges that cannot be easily dismissed or explained away. 37 children entered St. Catherine's home in the fall of 1920. 9 survived. The others did not simply die in a fire. Something else happened that December night, something connected to what Ezekiel Marsh had begun decades earlier, something that remains active in the Arkansas mountains. The research is incomplete. The questions remain unanswered. Those who have investigated, too, deeply have paid heavy prices. But the evidence is there for anyone willing to examine it with clear eyes and an open but critical mind. The Forest Service continues to maintain trails in the area. Hikers continue to visit, and incidents continue to be reported, particularly during the 7-year cycle that has held consistent since at least 1927. If you find yourself hiking in the Ouachita Mountains of western Arkansas, particularly in the area north of Mena, pay attention to your surroundings. If you see symbols carved deeply into pine trees, symbols that form geometric patterns, you are in the area once marked by Ezekiel Marsh for his experiments. If you hear singing in the forest, particularly the harmonized voices of children, do not investigate its source. If you see lights moving through the trees that do not behave like flashlights or natural phenomena, leave the area immediately. And if you become disoriented, if your compass begins to spin without settling, if you find yourself in a circular clearing where trees refuse to grow, run. Run without stopping until you find a marked trail, until you reach your vehicle, until you are far from that place. Because 37 children walked into those woods in 1920, only 9 returned, and those who did not return may still be there, singing in the darkness, waiting for others to join them in whatever terrible space exists beyond the boundary that Ezekiel Marsh tore open over a century ago. The St. Catherine's site is not simply a historical location. It is an active wound in reality, and wounds that are not properly closed can only grow larger with time.